The Royal Australian Navy's involvement in Vietnam was decidedly smaller than that of the Army, but nevertheless was significant in the history of our Navy. Nearly 3,000 personnel served in Vietnam, and we lost 6 killed in action, 2 killed in accidents, and 46 wounded. Over 80 medals were awarded, including 8 Orders of the British Empire, 9 Distinguished Service Crosses, 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 4 Distinguished Service Medals, and a similar number of British Empire medals, as well as 48 mentioned in dispatches. The Navy was involved from 1965 to 1972, and in that time, 4 destroyers operated on the gun line for a total of 9 deployments, fired over 100,000 rounds of either 4.5-inch or 5-inch ammunition. The clearance divers teams carried out nearly 7,500 bottom searches, and the helicopters of the Fleet RM flew a total of 32,700 flying hours. The destroyers suffered damage, one from shore artillery and one from air attack by a US Air Force jet. HMAS Sydney, the fast transport ship, carried out 22 trips to Vietnam, carrying a total of 16,094 troops, as well as their support equipment. 2 other ships, the Japarut and the Buraroo, carried a total of 44 trips, 18 of them while manned by RAN sailors. Additional involvement included that each time HMAS Sydney approached Vietnam, she was escorted by one of our 6 destroyer escorts or one of the 3 Daring-class destroyers. These destroyers would assume a wartime posture and actively search for submarine activity and maintain an active air and surface picture. It should be remembered that HMAS Sydney was carrying at times 600 to 700 troops and a sizable percentage of the Army's equipment. She was indeed a juicy target. In the harbour, the destroyers also provided active protection against diver and swimmer attack. While the RN was still a minor player compared to the Army, it did contribute 2,858 troops or personnel and lost 8 killed all up. The risk was also quite high because if the ship had been hit badly or sunk, the immediate casualty list often dwarfs that of other services. For example, when Voyager was lost in a peacetime collision, we lost 82 people in the space of a few minutes. To put that in context, we lost 41 soldiers under the entire Afghanistan deployment. The clearance diving team first went to Vietnam for a week in May of 1966 on a training rotation with the US Navy. In 1967, CD Team 3 was formed. That was 1 officer and 5 sailors for service in Vietnam, and they were the first RAN unit to deploy, arriving in Vietnam in February of 1967. There were a total of 8 contingents. The first contingent was awarded a unit citation by the USN. Probably the most difficult task they undertook was the defence of Vung Tau anchorage, which was a target for swimmer sappers who were specially trained North Vietnamese divers and Viet Cong who had completed a 9-month course in managing and setting mines. Mines were often towed under sampans and dropped in the high traffic areas. Fortunately, cold waters and fast currents made it difficult for the swimmers to operate over long distances. The second most dangerous task was probably disposal of explosive ordnance, and by the 3rd month of the deployment, the first contingent had almost a full-time employed clearing misfire ammunition. In one case, an 81mm round was stuck in a barrel for 12 hours. Our sailors removed it in the 2 hours and disposed of it without incident. Several contingents were involved in the salvage of equipment, ranging from crashed helicopters, sunken light craft, and from time to time armoured vehicles that went too deep while crossing a river. The range of work that the diving team undertook over their 8 deployments was varied and included body recovery after battles and ambushes as well as after accidents. The largest single commitment by the RAN to Vietnam was the provision of a destroyer on a rotational basis to the US Navy's 7th Fleet for service on what was to become known as the gun line. The RAN warships provided naval gunfire support from March 1967 to September 1971. They also participated in Operation Sea Dragon, the bombardment of North Vietnamese military targets, and the interdiction of supply routes and logistics craft moving along the coast of North Vietnam from the demilitarised zone to the Red River Delta. This happened from April 1967 until it was suspended in November 1968. The first RAN destroyer to deploy to Vietnam was the Charles F. Adams destroyer Hobart, followed by Perth and then Brisbane. The Australian DDGs were well suited to the task, providing naval gunfire support. They were armed with two 5-inch 54 calibre guns, firing a standard 76-pound high explosive shell. They were capable of bringing down accurate 5-inch gunfire at a rate of 40 rounds a minute on targets at ranges of beyond 14 nautical miles in most conditions. HMAS Hobart joined the 7th Fleet on March 1967, beginning a 6-month rotation of RAN destroyers for service on the gun line. Hobart and Perth deployed 3 times, Brisbane twice, and the Vendetta, a Deering-class destroyer, once. The destroyers carried out naval gunfire missions in all of South Vietnam's 4 military regions, and Hobart and Perth were actively involved in Sea Dragon. Hobart and Perth came under fire on a number of occasions. Perth was hit once during her first deployment, and Hobart suffered 2 killed and 7 wounded when she was mistakenly hit by missiles fired from a US Air Force jet aircraft. Hobart was awarded the US Navy Unit Citation in recognition of her service in Vietnam, while Perth received both the Unit Commendation and the USN Emeritus Unit Commendation. This honour being allowing both ships to fly a distinguishing pennant known as boogies from their masthead whenever alongside for the duration of their commissions. The Deering-class destroyer HMAS Vendetta was also deployed for service on the gun line. Her armament consisted of 6 4.5 guns, and they were capable of producing accurate and rapid fire for over a range of 9 nautical miles at a rate of 16 rounds per gun. In good conditions, Vendetta's guns were capable of expending about 100 rounds a minute. In their 5 years of service in Vietnam, the 4 gunline destroyers steamed over 397,000 miles and fired a total of 102,564 rounds. What is notable was during the Vendetta's deployment, it was difficult because her gunnery and spares needed to be provided from Australia, whereas the DDGs were able to be resupplied using the US fleet train. The next film shows a 4.5 turret in action. Filmed in 1990 before one of the last of the turrets was paid off. It gives you a short round of the firing a number of rounds. Nowhere near the full rate of fire, but it gives you an idea of the amount of work done in a manual turret of that type. Mention the Vung Tau ferry to any Vietnam veteran and they will immediately recall HMS Sydney, the former aircraft carrier that was later converted as a fast troop transport and destined to become the mainstay of naval logistics support operations for the Australian forces in Vietnam. Commissioned in 1948, the Sydney was a keystone in the development of Australia's post-war naval aviation capability and served with distinction in the Korean War. Sydney was converted to troopship duties in the early 60s and began her first voyage to Vietnam in May of 1965, transporting the 1st Battalion RAR from Sydney to Vung Tau in South Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1972, the Sydney undertook a total of 25 voyages to Vietnam and transported 16,094 troops, 5,753 deadweight tonnes of cargo, and 2,375 vehicles. On her first voyage, it took 4 days to unload the cargo in Vung Tau. On subsequent voyages, the turnaround time was reduced to a matter of hours. In 1966, Vietnam Supply Line was supplemented by 2 Australian National Line cargo ships, Japara and Boonaroo. These ships were chartered by the Department of Shipping and Transport on behalf of the Australian Army to transport military vehicles, ammunition, aid and canteen supplies. In March 1967, members of the Seamen's Union refused to man Japara and Boonaroo. To overcome this difficulty, Boonaroo was immediately commissioned by the Royal Australian Navy with a full naval crew for one return voyage to Cam Ranh Bay and Singapore. In the case of Japara, the existing crew were prepared to continue to serve in the ship as long as it was supplemented by a Royal Australian Navy detachment. She made a total of 21 voyages under the Red Ensign with a combined merchant naval crew. Further industrial action in December of 1969 prompted the federal government to commission Japara as one of her Her Majesty's Australian ships. HMAS Japara made a further 17 incident-free voyages under the Australian White Ensign, in which she carried a total of 175,000 deadweight tonnes of cargo to Vietnam before being returned to ANL control in March of 1972. It is no surprise that the Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam received the greatest number of casualties and was one of the most highly decorated units of the RAN during the war. The work was extremely dangerous, and it is estimated that in 1970, EMU pilots carrying soldiers into operation could expect to be fired on every second mission. Some pilots were particularly unlucky. Lieutenant Richard Malm, who served with the Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam in 1969-70, acquired the nickname Magnet because of the amount of firepower he attracted. His aircraft was hit on 11 separate occasions, one bullet piercing the windscreen and passing through his flying helmet. An unexpected danger came when the troops being carried by the EMU pilots. Over the time, it became apparent that Viet Cong were infiltrating the ranks of the Army of the Vietnam Republic. And when they landed, these soldiers would jump out, then turn back on the aircraft and open fire. They destroyed a number of aircraft and killed and wounded many personnel this way. It became unwritten law among the crews that if any deplaning Vietnamese soldier turned back towards the aircraft with his weapon in hand, they would immediately be fired upon. On the whole, the integration of the Australian Naval Unit within the 135th Assault Helicopter Company was successful. The Australians held a number of senior positions within the company, and each contingent leader was appointed second in command. A former American company commander, Major Paul Retz, commented in 1969, "It worked out real well. The executive officer, the operations officer and the platoon leader are all Aussies. I feel they add a lot to the unit. It gives the Americans insight into a different country and a different people. Lieutenant Commander Neil Ralph agreed with this assessment, saying in the post-tour interview that integration started out well at the outset and remained that way. It remained sound because there were a lot of respect among our American counterparts for the experience that the Australians had and their abilities in aircraft maintenance and operation. The helicopter flight Vietnam flew in Vietnam from October 1967 till June 1971. RAN pilots also provided pilots and crew to the helicopter squadron number 9 RAAF. That concludes this brief summary of the RAN in Vietnam. More information can be found in the books, the RAN in Vietnam, and there have been a number written over this time. It is a proud history of our Navy and should not be forgotten just because it was relatively small. Thank you.